As countries are battling the worst global pandemic since the Second World War, many believe COVID-19 will forever change the international order as we know it. Will COVID-19 make countries more inward-looking, conservative, and nationalistic, or will it make countries more open and more cooperative to fight this common challenge? Will the pandemic undermine globalization and multilateralism, or will it actually strengthen them? I have a distinguished panel to discuss and debate all these issues. They are Commodore C. Uday Bhaskar, Director of Society for Policy Studies in New Delhi, Yuan Peng, President of China Institute of Contemporary International Relations, Daniel Russell, Vice President for International Security and Diplomacy at the Asia Society Policy Institute, Martin Jakes, author of When China Rules the World, and last but not least, Professor Tan Ki-Jep, Chairman of Singapore National Committee for Pacific Economic Cooperation Council. Now, to begin, gentlemen, I want to invite each of you to make an opening statement. Will COVID-19 bring more unity or division among nation states? Mr. Russell, why don't I start with you in New York City?
Look, the bitter irony of COVID-19 is that it is a transnational pandemic. It's the kind of threat that transcends any national borders and that requires a global response, but it's instead had the paradoxical effect of serving to strengthen not national borders. So not only have governments imposed restrictions on international travel, not only have they responded primarily on a national basis, but now even the quest for a vaccine is being undertaken independently by various countries instead of as a combined global initiative. In fact, you see countries being quite wary about outsourcing medical and pharmaceutical supplies to other sources in foreign countries. So the supply chain, in a way, is being weaponized.
All right, Martin Jakes, what do you think?
China, not just from the United States, but other Western countries as well, was assaulted for and heavily criticized for a lack of openness, lack of information, and so on, which, standing back from it, seems really remarkably exaggerated, given how long it took the Western countries to get things together and how difficult they found it to handle the pandemic. What conclusion do I draw from this? Well, it's quite similar to Daniel's, really. I think that what the pandemic has revealed is that the relationship with the United States and China has deteriorated, that deterioration has been accentuated during the pandemic, and as we come out of the pandemic eventually, I think the relationship between the United States and China will be worse. And we are moving towards a much more divided and bifurcated world.
Well, it seems that Mr. Russell and Martin are both arguing that COVID-19 actually, unfortunately, brought nations, drove them further apart. Mr. Bhaskar in New Delhi, do you agree?
I would say that yes, at the moment when we look at the turbulence that has been created by the COVID-19 pandemic, there are two words that come to mind. One is that there has been the equivalent of global disarray, and concurrently, as my other colleagues on the panel have pointed out, there has been a fair amount of discord amongst the major powers, particularly that between the United States and China. So the way I see it as an analyst is that as far as global governance, global cooperation and international diplomacy are going to become very complex, very contradictory and very contested. So I think for the short term, for the next 3 to 5 years, there would be a fair amount of uncertainty, and largely because I think the new framework for global leadership or even for global consensus is going to be very elusive.
Sure. Professor Tan.
Beijing?
Yeah. A post-pandemic world, more unity or division?
Well, I just want to make 2 points, slightly different from the perspective of Danny. That I think my first point is the post-pandemic COVID-19 will be more complicated. For the first reason, because there is a trade-off between economic costs and lockdown, and how fast and when do you unlock, which means the economic recovery will vary. Well, in the West, very individualistic, but in the Asia side, we are very disciplined in terms of the community and working with the government. So because the economic recovery will be different, because you look at the West now, they basically are not out of the wood yet. So that will make things more complicated in terms of, say, US-China trade deal. So that's my first point. Now, the second point, it is very clear now, in terms of healthcare capacity, developed or developing economies, now they are found short in terms of the capacity to deal with this. And also, vaccine, we haven't found any. So if China were to be very generous to go and help those countries, whether developed or developing, and that will be perceived as you are assertive in your leadership. And then US is very fast trying to secure the vaccine by the end of the year. And I suppose this also demonstrates leadership. So this contest of leadership, whether it's real or imaginary or perceived, I think it itself will make the post-pandemic world more complicated.
President Yuan Peng in Beijing, what do you think?
Yes, I think even before the COVID-19, the world has already experienced unprecedented changes in hundreds of years, which means the world order, international structure, and the major power relations is already changing very rapidly and critically. This pandemic and COVID-19 just accelerate this trend rather than change the trend, make the changing even more critical. I think in the future, if this COVID-19 reunited the world or separate the world even worse, really depends on 2 factors. Number one, how long will this COVID-19 last? The second factor is how the major powers cooperate. And one potential wild card is American domestic politics. That is November, the election. So this election makes the virus much more politicized. The electoral virus is not that terrible, but the political virus makes us even more worrisome. That's my point.
As you all know, basically there are 2 schools of thoughts in international relations. One that argues, believes in realism, saying that self-interested nation states will eventually compete, if not confront each other. The other school of liberalism, believers say that through cooperation, through cultural and people-to-people and trade exchange, eventually countries will coexist in peace. Do you think COVID-19 is an ultimate test of the 2 theories? And which theories, which of the 2 theories is prevailing at the moment? Daniel.
Well, I regret to say, as a committed internationalist, that even before the COVID outbreak, we were seeing a backlash against the multilateral globalist order in much of the West, certainly. And now we're seeing nationalism taking the place of the global order. And in Washington, you've got America first. In Beijing, you've got the China dream. We're seeing protectionism substituting for globalized free trade. So it seems like COVID-19 has really accelerated nationalism in ways that are impacting international relations, international organizations, supply chains, public health, medicine. And particularly what I see and I'm concerned about is that multilateral institutions, which are the product of a deliberate effort over the decades to create forums for cooperation, have instead increasingly been turned into forums for competition. And that has in many cases led to deadlock on issues where there's an urgent need for collaboration. In other cases, it's led to a sort of leaderless drift. So the trend, regrettably, both politically, geopolitically, and geoeconomically, is towards not only nationalism, but in many cases, a kind of hyper-nationalism.
Martin, what do you think?
Well, of the binary choice you gave us about international relations, I think it's got to be a move towards realism rather than a move towards international cooperation. I mean, I think that's patently evident. I mean, what's unhinged the situation globally is the shift in mood in America. It's not the shift in mood in China, it's the shift in mood in America. Of course, it was because of China's rise that the shift in America began to take place. And there was a moment which more or less we can see being played out around the time of the last presidential election, but it was building up beforehand, was what I would call a growing sense of hegemonic angst in the United States. That until that point, China's rise was something which could be contained within the sort of arrangement that existed that underpinned the Sino-American relationship. But at this point, there began to be a really significant shift. And China was now interpreted in a different way, in a different context, as a threat. And that has become more and more important and more organizing the international scene. And the problem we face now is how far is this going to go? Because the deterioration is continuing. We've seen it during the pandemic, and I think on afterwards. And what can be done to try and find a way of easing this process, or even stopping this process, or hopefully one day reversing this process? And I think that's an important question. Well, we can see it being played out in America, but also I think it's a question facing the Chinese government as well, is what can we do to prevent this continuing deterioration?
Right, Mr. Bhaskar, what do you think?
I think the decisions taken by the United States in terms of its own domestic politics, the transition from Obama to Trump, has led, I think, to a complete kind of rearrangement in a very, very turbulent manner as far as global norms, global leadership are concerned. So my plea from India, sitting here as an analyst, would be that perhaps we have to go back to the drawing board, whether it's in Washington, in Beijing, Delhi, elsewhere, and return to some kind of ethical foreign policy, ethical public policy. And my understanding of ethics is enlightened self-interest. And here I think the experience of every major country, including China, if I may say so, is that the common citizen has paid a very heavy price because of the pandemic. Whether it's in Wuhan, whether it's in New York, whether it's in London, whether it's in Mumbai, I think the plight of the common citizen should become the central feature in how public policy is now framed, as opposed to what we learnt in the post-Cold War, where the market and profit had become the only two guiding principles for public policy.
Well, Professor Tan, in Singapore, which school of thought do you think best describes what's happening now and what will happen going forward?
So Singapore is a very small country with the most open economy. We trade 3 times our GDP. And I'm from Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy. So public policy is very important to us. And I think there must be ways that the major powers will come together. But now we're talking about emerging Cold War, and countries are beginning to take position. And Singapore would never want to be forced to choose sides. So I would like to say this. In order to work closer, World Health Organization must continue to take its leadership to address this issue globally. And then from the other public policy aspect is major trading partners, especially China, must take initiative to reform the World Trade Organization. And Singapore will be very happy to also support any effort to reform the World Trade Organization. So globalization with the heart, with a more inclusive society, can be engineered.
President Yuan Peng in Beijing, your thoughts?
Yeah, those two schools of theory are very typical Western international. However, the COVID-19 proved that Leiter's theory can explain the situation or even cannot resolve the problems. So maybe liberalism with a more realistic manner. However, today the liberalism in in the Western world seems, decline. In particular, the Brexit plus the American First initiated by Trump, which we should embrace globalization, multilateralism, and cooperation, which liberalism, appreciated. However, we didn't see this. But another theory that realism, which advocated the big power competition and the power matters. But the realism means the competition is in a more mature way, in a rational way. But today we see the major power competition in a very irrational way. And for example, put the ideological driven factors much more important than the big power competition.
I want to shift gears a little bit and talk about U.S.-China relations. Daniel, I want to go to you in New York City. Where do you think this relation, can the two countries still avoid the Thucydides trap of great power rivalry at this point?
Well, the U.S.-China relationship is headed downward. It's in a downward spiral, and unfortunately, it seems to be accelerating. Attitudes in both China and the United States are hardening to the point where, far from looking for cooperation, we see evidence that each side in some ways is deliberately working to undermine and to damage the other. As Professor Yuan just said, there's increasingly an ideological and an irrational component to it. So public attitudes are clearly souring. We see that in opinion polls. And we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that people-to-people relations built on academic exchanges and on business relationships, that's the safety net that can keep the relationship intact in times of great friction or stress. And if that net is degraded, then it is that much harder to slow or stop the free fall in the U.S.-China relationship. Now,
stopping the free fall.
There is
indeed.
There is an election coming up, obviously, in the U.S. But after the election is over, I think American frustration and concern about what both Democrats and Republicans see as very problematic behavior by China will remain. And I don't think it's reasonable to expect that the Chinese people or Chinese leaders are going to forget the actions that have been taken and the insults that have been hurled from the United States against China and against the Chinese people. That also isn't easily going to dissipate. So while America would have the opportunity to try to hit the reset button if Biden administration came into office, and while a Biden administration would, I think, in Professor Tan's great phrase, pursue globalization with a heart, pursuing stable and constructive bilateral U.S.-China relations with a heart is going to be a very formidable challenge.
U.S.-China relations with a heart, that would be the hope of many. Martin, where are U.S.-China relations headed?
They're headed for progressive deterioration. In fact, what we've witnessed since the beginning of this year is a rapid acceleration in the deterioration. The question is how this deterioration can be decelerated in some way, and what's going to change it. And this worries me a lot, because if you think about the underlying reasons for the shift in the United States, which are assumption that America is the dominant power in the world, is the global leader, and that is under threat from China. And of course, it is under threat from China. I don't think China is the problem here, though. I think the United States is the problem. But because the United States is the problem, it's also China's problem. And that's, how do we get out of that situation, that Gordian knot?
Well, Mr. Basker, I want to move on to our next topic, that is global leadership. Do you think there is a global leadership vacuum right now? Think about America's withdrawal from multilateral institutions. And if so, do you think, as Mr. Kishore Mahbubani, a distinguished professor from Singapore, put it, we're moving from a US-centric globalization to a more China-centric globalization?
I think the first part of your question, is there a vacuum in terms of global leadership? My answer is yes. But the second part that you have added, does it mean that now we are seeing the emergence of Chinese leadership to fill the vacuum? My answer is, I'm afraid no, because in as much as China has a self-image of itself and a sense that China is now trying to project to the world that it's a mature country, it's a responsible country, and that the rise of China is not a threat to the other powers, much less to the United States, is not a self-image that is shared, definitely not in the United States. And if you talk about global leadership and say, which is the forum where this global leadership is demonstrated and it is proven, you could look at the United Nations Security Council.
Right.
Now, in the last few years, there has been no consensus on any major issue, and the pandemic, COVID-19, is a good example. So I think for China, we are now aware of the problem in the United States, which my other panelists have pointed out ever since Mr. Trump has become the president. But I think China has to introspect and say that if you look at China and its immediate neighborhood, the image that Beijing has of itself is not shared by the neighbors. For instance, in ASEAN, in East Asia, in South Asia. So I think the warrior diplomacy that China is now embarking upon is very far removed from the image of China with a global heart, or China that wants to encourage harmony in its interaction with the rest of the world.
Well, points
Beijing.
taken. Professor Khan in Singapore, Director Basker in New Delhi just mentioned ASEAN. As Singapore is, of course, an important member of ASEAN, what does Singapore want to see in terms of global governance structure?
I'll take the challenge from Professor Martin about how to decelerate the deteriorating relationship between U.S. and China. I think ASEAN can play a role here. Now, if there's any achievement by President Trump's administration, achievement within inverted comma, is that in the United States now, there is a broad consensus, whether it's Republican or Democrat, contain China has become the norm. And the ordinary people in the United States, the anti-Chinese sentiment has built up, including Singaporeans perceived to be Chinese. So therefore, Singapore always take the position, and same position for ASEAN, is that China is not containable. You cannot prevent China to improve the technology, to have more trade. It is not containable. Now, we think that, I'm more pessimist, in the post-pandemic, and this bipolar two globalization center will appear. And ASEAN, we have half the population of China. We are about 630 million. This is a big market. And ASEAN will be the next manufacturing hub of the world, thanks to the United States of the US-China friction. So therefore, ASEAN should have a very open mind to host multinational, whether it's from the Europeans or United States or Korea or Japan, into ASEAN. So ASEAN may have to, in a position that nobody can force us to choose side.
Mr. Yuan Peng in Beijing, I want to ask you this question. We just heard from China's Foreign Minister and State Councilor Wang Yi at a press conference during the two sessions. What do you think China can contribute when it comes to perfecting or changing the global governance structure?
Yes, global governance is typical Western concept, which Chinese are not so familiar with in past decades. And now, because of that, the Western powers like US and Great Britain are all pursue the American first, Great Britain first, the so-called global governance, now lack of leadership. So those countries like the United States was long being viewed world leadership. Sometimes it plays a good job. For example, the coalition on counterterrorism at the very first years of after September 11th, and after financial crisis in 2008, initiated the so-called G20 summit, which China totally supported. During that time, I think Americans do play some leadership role. But this time, we were unfortunate to see that America didn't play any kind of leadership. then the world will come. Maybe China should play some kind of role. But you know, China is, has low interest to play the leadership role. We, at most, we want to play a leading role in some aspects. For example, in this counter pandemic virus, we provide as big as possible for providing some facilities and help to the world health affairs. However, I think even we did this in our own way, but still viewed by many Western medias as that China wants to make use of this to achieve some geopolitical ambitions. So this is unfair. So even if the world welcomes China to play some bigger role, and China knows that our own capacity and we know the current international situations. So on the one hand, we want to give people a better life. This is our major job. On the other hand, we want to play some responsible role in the world. If you view this as a leadership role, that's okay. But for China, we prefer to we want to play some responsible role as a major power. We want to play some leading role in some aspects that in our own advantages. Thank you.
Fascinating discussions. I'm afraid that's all the time we have for the moment. I want to thank all our guests for today. Director Bhaskar in New Delhi, President Yuan Peng in Beijing, Daniel Russell in New York City, Martin Jakes in the UK, and Mr. Tan from Singapore. Thank you all so very much. We learned a lot. Thank you. And that will do it for this edition of Dialogue. I'm Wong Guan in Beijing, and I'll see you again soon.